I'm Julian Pooley. I'm the Public Services and Engagement Manager at Surrey Heritage, which is based at Surrey History Centre here in Woking.
And we're going to talk about the long stay hospitals. I mean, it's a really interesting subject, and I know around the Epsom area especially, a cluster of these hospitals. I mean, why the Epsom area? Why would we find them there?
Well, the land was available basically. London County Council was established in 1889. And it was faced with a huge task of caring for the people who were mentally ill or suffering what we would now call learning disabilities in its area. It already ran some huge institutions at Coney Hatch and at Hanwell in Ealing and even in Surrey at Banstead Hospital. But they weren't enough, so that it bought the Horton Manor estate in the late 19th century and opened 5 hospitals there. So the first one to open was the Manor, that opened in 1899. Then you've got Horton, which opened around 1907, I think. You've got St Ebba's, which was an epileptic colony, because in those days epilepsy was seen as a psychiatric condition rather than a physical condition. And you've got Long Grove, which is another huge psychiatric institution. And then the war came along, so there was a pause, and West Park opened in 1924 when the Great War had finished. So you've got these huge institutions all together. I think they covered a square mile in area. They were the biggest concentration of such institutions, I think, in Europe, but probably the world. So it's vast.
And what do we know about life inside the institutions?
Well, obviously it's very different then. These places were run very much regulated lines, operated under national legislation, inspected by London County Council and its officers very regularly. But, I mean, the size of them gives you an idea of the sort of regime that would have been followed there. I've got a picture here of it's an aerial photograph of Horton Hospital, which is, I think, one of the biggest of them. And the first thing you'll notice, it's like looking down at a small town. These are vast.
So it's very much a self-contained community.
Yeah, with their own farms, workshops, laundries, hairdressers, bookbinders, you name it. And the great thing to notice, the first thing to notice on these plans is this arch of a corridor which runs in a semicircle right around the site. So you've got the administrative buildings at the front and all of the refectories and recreation halls behind that, central water tower, which was a major landscape feature. But you've got the corridor that wraps right around the site, an enormously long corridor, and as you can see here, the wards are radiating out like the spokes of a wheel, and each of these wards would have been self-contained. One side would have had men in it, and the other side of the hospital would have had women in it. They did not mix.
And why was that? Why would
to keep regulation, really. It was all to absolute propriety in care, and the size of the wards you can see here on this picture taken from the grounds looking back at the hospital. It's a vast site, it really is, setting very spacious grounds with their own farms, piggeries. It's all laid on, and the patients would have worked in those farms and in the laundries. They weren't confined to their wards at all. They were very much encouraged to work and take part in the life of the hospital.
Okay. And would they have ever gone outside of hospital grounds?
Yes, they'd have gone outside the hospital grounds. If you were well enough and you had a ticket, a pass from the medical superintendent, you could go out, go home at weekends to see your family on occasion when you were on that process of recovery, to see how it went. But other patients would have been allowed out of the hospital environs to go shopping in Epsom on a Saturday afternoon or something like that. Obviously, you had to be well enough to do that. Not everyone had that privilege. I may be making it out to be a nicer place than it was. A lot of these hospitals, people had some pretty awful times there. Yeah. A lot of the medical processes that they took place in the mid 20th century were what we would call barbaric now. But you have to remember that they were the accepted way of doing things at the time. The doctors felt that they were doing the best they could, and we've learned from their mistakes. But essentially they were aiming to help people and wanted people to go home better and recovered. It wasn't a life sentence. There was a revolving door of people coming in and out.
Okay, and so we ended up with the hospitals being closed, and care in the community coming in, and people moving into different sorts of accommodation actually within the community. I mean, how did that sort of come about? Why would the hospitals close? What happened there?
Well, it was two things really. As the 20th century progressed and science advanced, drugs became available which could help to manage people's psychiatric conditions more easily. And even in the 1950s, I've seen reports in the archives we rescued from Long Grove, looking forward to a time, perhaps by the 1990s, when institutions like this could close. So they saw it coming. The need for confining people in a huge institution diminished as drugs became available, which helped people to manage their conditions, either with help from social workers or on their own. So that was one part of it. But of course, by the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the governments of the day were becoming increasingly uncomfortable that these huge, sprawling institutions were not really the right way in which people should be cared for in the late 20th century. The hospitals closed very rapidly around 1994, 5, 96, and I just happened to be in the right place at the right time because this is before we had Surrey History Centre. I was based at a converted boys' school in the centre of West Ewell, and I was on hand to react to the closure of the hospitals. So we would get information from the hospital authorities, but also from the community to say that St Edward's was closing on such and such a date, and we would go in and do a survey of the records and arrange to rescue those that were worthy of historical preservation. And we were absolutely amazed by the scale of the records that we found. There were tens of thousands of case books, admission and discharge registers, individual case files, psychiatric social workers files, you name it, all going back to when the hospitals opened. It was an incredible resource, and we worked really hard, often in the most difficult conditions, to rescue those records. Some of them had been kept in cellars and were very, very wet and mouldy. Others were in utter chaos, and in some hospitals, notably Horton Hospital, no one actually knew where the records were. There was a rumour that there was a records room, but it took me about 6 visits to find that room.
Wow.
And when I eventually found it, it was in utter chaos.
Wow, so really kind of a race against time before the bulldozers came in just to save those records then?
Absolutely it was. And in St Edward's, we were given 4 days' notice before the bulldozers attacked, started work on the room where the records were. So we had to move very fast there. But we rescued about 11,000 case files from that building.
And then where did you take these records from when you moved them from the site? Where did they go?
Initially to our repository in Ewell, because that was a processing centre for new material, and that's where they were cleaned and packaged, and a lot of them were put through a blast freezer to kill the insects and the creepy crawlies that were busy eating them. But they were conserved. But around 1998, Surrey County Council, which runs Surrey History Centre, managed to find the capital funding to build us a brand new history centre here in Woking, where we're sitting today. Yeah. This is a fantastic building with 6 miles of shelving and conservation rooms and all the equipment necessary for preserving these fragile materials. So they're all here in the building behind us in the strong rooms now.
Well, I mean, and it's so important, isn't it, to have these records, because if you hadn't stepped in there, they would have been lost, and we wouldn't have an insight so much to what life was like within these hospitals.
That's absolutely true, and despite our best efforts, we didn't get everything. I mean, at Long Grove, which was absolutely vast, with about 28 separate wards and outlying villas, the case files, I think they covered about 900 linear feet, and they were all burned by the staff when the hospital closed because there was nowhere for them to go. You couldn't have them going into a skip or falling into the wrong hands because they contain extremely personal medical information. The safest thing that they could do at the time, which is a tragedy from our point of view, but from then it was the right thing for them to do. They got rid of them. They burnt them. So we lost those, but we managed to rescue an awful lot of records, not just from the cluster hospitals, but from Brookwood here in Woking, from Holloway Sanatorium at Egham, from the Royal Elswood Asylum at Redhill, and especially from Netherton Hospital. So we're now reckoned by Professor David Wright of McGill University in Canada to have the greatest collection of mental health records in the English-speaking world.
Wow, I mean that's amazing. I mean, it's a great resource you've got here, and it's great that you've got these records, and it can just bring those stories to life. And there's still, people that may, have obviously moved out of the hospitals, moved into accommodation within the community, but they've still got living memories, haven't they, of their time at the hospitals?
Very much so, and very valuable memories. And what we found is the most exciting records that we rescued are often the most insignificant. press cuttings and photograph albums, even loose photographs, which I picked up off the floor at Brookwood as we were leaving, of the hospital fate. Show those to people who remember the hospitals, who are now living in sheltered accommodation around the area, and they can tell us what's going on. They even recognise people. So we're tapping into a fantastic oral history resource there of people's memories, and we're always keen to hear from anyone who has memories of the hospital.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing about history. You can read about something in a textbook, but to hear a real life story and to sort of hear people's first-hand accounts, it just brings it alive. It's alive, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and it's an immediacy, and it reminds you also that these are not just historical documents. They are records of people's lives. They contain very fragile and personal accounts of the conditions that people have lived with and experienced across the 20th century. So we do treat them extremely sensitively, and there are strict guidelines in place for how you access those records. If something's over 100 years old, then you can be pretty sure that the person's died. So those are open. But any records, medical records that are less than 100 years old, we just need to go through a certain amount of hoops to tick all the right boxes for data protection and freedom of information. But the key thing is that we've preserved that story.
What remains today of the hospitals in Epsom?
The buildings are largely are still there. I mean, Long Grove has been redeveloped into accommodation, and I think St Ebba's as well. Certainly Horton is a huge development on the footprint of the site. They've retained some of the existing buildings, the wards and the staff accommodation, because they were perfectly sound structures. Same goes for West Park. But they've also built new buildings on the site. But the great thing about Horton is that the chapel, which has lain in ruins for so many years, has been rescued by an amazing team of people who have restored it into an arts centre where there's an exhibition that records the lives of the people who were at those hospitals.
And I know you gave a hugely successful talk at that venue on its opening night, didn't you?
It was great, and well over 80 people turned up, some of them former members of staff, and they seemed to enjoy it. There were loads of questions that went on for some time after the conversation had finished. So that was a really successful event. And the other thing we haven't covered, of course, is that the hospitals also had a cemetery. There was a central cemetery for the Epsom cluster, where thousands of people, mostly poor people whose families were too poor to have the bodies returned to them, those people were buried by the hospital authorities, 6 deep in some cases, in what are now unmarked graves. And there's a tremendous charity, the Friends of Horton Cemetery, who are now researching the lives of all the people who were buried there. And in some cases we're able to find photographs of those patients from the case books or the original glass plate photographs taken when they were at the hospital to really bring those stories to life.
It sounds like you're working with lots of different organisations and just trying to preserve the memories, and I bet you get a real buzz when you uncover something new and you get that sort of breakthrough.
You find that every day. There's always something new to discover in these records, and always someone, needing your help. We receive 2 or 3 inquiries every day from people all over the world who have a question about the Epsom cluster hospitals. Their ancestor may have been a patient there, or their relatives may have been employed there as members of staff, and they want to learn more about their time there and the world that has now vanished from sight.
And okay, so if we want to find out more about about this, I mean, what's the best?
Well, yes, certainly contact us at Surrey History Centre. What I would always suggest people do is to go onto our website, Exploring Surrey's Past. Tremendous website. And if you look at the menu bar there's something called Themes. Click on that. Go down to hospitals, and there are pages and pages of information on all of these cluster hospitals, but also other hospitals across Surrey, plus some little videos that we've made with people talking about the records as well. That's the first place to start. And then if you have any questions, just email us and we're happy to help.